event of the Energy Vision series. You will have seen the other two events that were moderated by my colleague Sarah Stefanini, who's here. So I'm happy to see you all here for tonight. Thank you, of course, to Shell, who has been making these events possible. As you will know, the events are live streamed and we're on Twitter, and we encourage you all to comment and engage on Twitter. And as before, we'd much appreciate if you could give us your evaluations at the end of the event. It's always very useful to make these events even better in future. And with that, thank you for being here. And I'd like to introduce our first speaker, David Horn, who is the Chief Climate Change Advisor at Shell International. Thank you.
Good. Well, good evening, and thank you for inviting me to speak here tonight. So I spent several days at COP23. I think probably many people in the audience did, and I know that the speakers did tonight. I think, first of all, we need to congratulate the government of the Republic of Fiji and, of course, the government of the Federal Republic of Germany for staging this event and staging it so successfully. But thinking about COP23, what can we draw from this coming together of governments, activists, observers, and all the other people that were there? I spent a lot of time in the bond zone, and it was impressive to see the scale of this bond zone. This is where actions being taken by countries, by states, by cities, and various civil society groups were all on display. As part of this, there was also a formidable presence from US governors and city mayors, making it very clear that the United States would continue its obligations under the Paris Agreement. And you probably all saw the hashtag #WeAreStillIn. In fact, such was the presence of all of these non-state actors that some would argue that the non-state actors alone can achieve the outcomes of the Paris Agreement, that cities alone with states and regions can do the job. But let's sort of cast our minds forward to 2070 and think about a world in which non-state actors have been left to do this job. Certainly, this will be a world with new technologies, a world with considerable use of renewable energy, but will it be a world of net zero emissions? Because it's not until we reach a world of net zero emissions that we can actually stabilize the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and get the temperature to plateau. I think a collection of well-intentioned regional and city-based activities is not going to get us to this job, to this goal. There's too much going on behind the scenes to keep everything running. And I just think about, lots of people in this audience tonight are holding an iPhone or a smartphone. There's 75 elements from the periodic table in one of these devices. And there's about 4 billion of them on the planet. And all of those materials have to be mined and extracted and brought to factories. None of them are produced in cities. And so it's really not without the UNFCCC and the process that it embodies that we're likely to get to the net zero emissions outcome. It's going to require their leadership, along with the leadership of the EU, ASEAN, OECD, and others, to reach this goal. And so for this reason, COP23 was an important COP, as will be COP24 and COP25 and so on. We might look at each of these and think that the progress is limited, but without this journey, the goal won't be reached. Achieving stabilization of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, net zero emissions, was never going to be an easy task. But the UNFCCC process has persisted, and it's allowed society globally to mobilize around their process and deliver on many fronts. The climate issue has grown in profile at all levels, and international leaders talk about this constantly. The media talks about it. We don't always like what they say, but it's front and center on a daily basis. Economists have taken up the challenge and write and talk about carbon pricing. Most national governments have climate change policies embodied in their national policy structures. Measurement reporting of greenhouse gases is ubiquitous around the world. Carbon trading has been developed. Carbon capture and storage has become a commercial technology, but deployment remains limited. And lots of new technologies in power generation, transport, and industry are rapidly evolving. For the EU, with the 2020 to 2030 energy package reaching a successful conclusion, the prospect of net zero emissions now needs to enter our collective thinking. And the EU is in a good place to do this. I think looking at the energy package, observers are confident that it's going to deliver. There's still room to complete, there's still jobs to complete, particularly in the policy framework that sits around the EU ETS. And one example, for instance, is the criteria for power generation, such that we limit the overall emissions from that system, so that, for instance, capacity payments for coal don't distort the carbon market. But the world will need to be at net zero emissions by around 2070. And so I think we have to think about what that means for the EU. The EU is a leader in this area, and countries within the EU are leading the EU. And so, for instance, Sweden has their eyes on 2045 for net zero emissions. So for the EU, you might imagine this has to happen in the 2050s. But by the 2050s, aviation won't be at zero emissions, shipping won't be, a number of industrial processes such as cement manufacture, chemicals, steel production, glass manufacture are unlikely to be at zero emissions. The only way this is going to happen is to introduce carbon capture and storage into the EU. And the EU's been talking about this for a number of years, probably 15 years at least. But the 2020s have to start to see this technology really deployed on a large scale so that the 2030, 2040 period can be a real focus for reaching net zero emissions. The international process also has to play an important role here. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement can facilitate the development of a global system of interconnected markets, ideally with the EU ETS at the centre of that. And this could include trade in sequestered carbon dioxide. And that's going to be essential for economies to be confident that they can reach net zero emissions. So this means the UNFCCC process is important in the EU's goal to reach net zero emission as well as the global goal to do this. So carbon capture and storage, carbon trading, sequestration at national level in all different parts of the world are going to have to come together to reach this goal. And so that's the challenge that we face in the years ahead, and that's the one, hopefully, that can spawn some discussion tonight. I look forward to the coming discussion, and I thank you for letting me give some opening thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Hahn, especially for raising some of the challenges that I look forward to discussing in a second. But first, I would like to invite Ambassador Khan to the stage and have a discussion about the last 2 weeks. And just to be short, my name is Kalina Roshakov. I'm an energy and climate reporter at POLITICO Europe, and I look forward to being the host tonight. So please. So, nice to meet you here on the stage. I remember seeing you from a far distance in Bonn, where my colleague and I were running around for the last 2 weeks, which was interesting. It was an interesting development to see a COP at Bonn, before in Marrakesh, and then of course the great one in Paris. Based on your personal experience, what was your personal low point in those 2 weeks in Bonn?
One tries to start at the highest point to give everyone a sense of optimism and success. So I think really the lowest point would be not having enough sleep, not being able to eat properly, and realizing at about midnight on a particular day that it was my birthday and I just missed it.
Oh,
Yeah. So
well,
that was
happy belated
definitely
birthday.
that was definitely a low point. But let me say that this was an extraordinary undertaking for Fiji because we're a small island developing state, and it was a real challenge to have the presidency of a COP on the other side of the world, where it was very, very cold for the average Fijian, and where, in fact, a small island developing state had never taken on the presidency, which it was an enormous undertaking. And so, of course, throughout this journey, there were moments of self-doubt as to whether we could do this successfully, whether we could do it with aplomb, and most importantly, whether we could really bring the Pacific methodology of communicating and of having events to Bonn, and I think we succeeded in that.
I mean, based on the fact that the negotiations did go on till, I think, 4:30 in the morning on Saturday, certainly the talking was successful. In terms of the results, where would you say were the three main results that you achieved?
What started off very much as a working COP at the beginning of the year, where everyone had expectations that COP23 should produce discernible progress on the Paris Agreement work program, that COP23 should introduce the design for the facilitative dialogue, as it was then called, and should show progress on a number of other individual items, suddenly changed in its nature after President Trump's announcement, because suddenly every eye was on Fiji's presidency to show leadership and to show that, in fact, the vision of the Paris Agreement was intact and the global community was united behind the Paris Agreement. So there were moments of expectation, I think, for Fiji to lead. And suddenly what was going to be a working COP only suddenly became an opportunity for inspiration and vision, for the renewal of vision. And so we were very aware that we had to deliver a package at COP23 that was indicative of this general vision, and I think we did. So in addition to, of course, the work we had to do in relation to the Paris Agreement work program and the Talanoa dialogue, as it is now called, we had really important visionary outcomes, which were very people-centered. So the Gender Action Plan, which came after 12 years of hard work to integrate gender into climate policy.
I'd also like to point out, you might have noticed that we have a lot of women on the panel today. So we've made our own effort to integrate gender in the discussion.
Yes, indeed. Also the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, which was made operational at COP23. Again, that was a lot of very passionate negotiation which went behind it because there was a symbolic advance there on the role of observers in the negotiations, which has always been a difficult conversation. And of course, it was just as difficult this time, but a very good result was produced in the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, so that was excellent. The unprecedented involvement of children, not just in the Bonn zone, but also at the high-level segment. We had a child who opened the high-level segment. So I think that, COP23 had this enormous expectation that we wouldn't just deliver on the work, but that we would also deliver on vision. And I think we did that. I'm very pleased to say.
Yes, I mean, we did notice the emphasis on vision, but as you yourself say, you're from Fiji, you're from an island that is affected already by the effects of climate change today, probably more than some Europeans here. So it is unfortunately more than about just vision. And so looking ahead to COP24, which will, or is at least considered to be the major political moment when countries have to agree on the rulebook underpinning the deal, what needs to concretely happen between now and then to ensure that this rulebook can be actually agreed?
In addition to the rulebook, a very important conversation took place at COP23 about pre-2020 urgency. And this was an initiative brought by several developing countries, and it quickly gained momentum because there was a very strong feeling amongst countries that in this surge of activity towards preparing for the Paris Agreement, we'd forgotten about pre-2020 action. And so there was a very good conversation around pre-2020, and you will see from the COP23 outcomes that this featured as an important part of the outcome. So in addition to the Paris Agreement work program, we also had a very good result on pre-2020, which as a small island developing state in the Pacific, you know, one cannot underestimate the importance of urgency in climate action. So in relation to the Paris Agreement work program, of course, very importantly, we begin to see the contours of what the guidelines are going to look like at COP24. And I think we can be very optimistic that the negotiations will be progressively constructive, that they already showed sign of progress in some very knotty and difficult areas. And I'm quite confident that COP24 will produce the Paris Agreement work program in its entirety. It is more than probable that there will be an extra session for negotiations. And of course, although parties were not required to decide anything at COP23, they were certainly expected to show signs of progress and certainly their contours of the end decision. And they did that.
You're mentioning that probably another negotiating session will have to take place next year, but then we're also starting with next month with Emmanuel Macron's One Planet Summit. And then in California next year, and as well some other major climate events, that we have a number of high-level political events that are leading up to the COP24 in Katowice in Poland. What is the role of those high-level political events in contrast to negotiations during the talks?
I think these high-level events are very important for their inspirational value and for creating spaces for constructive discussions. I think these discussions really move on the negotiations quite dramatically because they create a space where people can talk in a way which is non-confrontational, which is non-adversarial. I'm really a lawyer, unbelievable. I actually like non-adversarial conversations, and I think that ultimately the effect of these spaces that we create is to ease the negotiations, to make them easier and more constructive. And I think really these are very significant events that are about to occur, and one just in 2 weeks' time.
So what do you expect from Paris? What is going to happen in Paris? Many of us are wondering exactly what is the purpose.
My understanding is that Paris is going to focus on climate financing. And that, of course, is a very important conversation. There's a very good reason to talk constructively about the 100 billions. And in fact, at pre-COP, we had a very dedicated session about climate financing. And we were very encouraged to see the positive determination to deliver on the 100 billion. So that was really encouraging, and I'm sure that the Paris Climate Finance Summit is going to have more conversations about that. Also, I believe about the Adaptation Fund and how it is going to serve the Paris Agreement. You're aware at COP23 a decision was made that the Adaptation Fund shall serve the Paris Agreement, although of course the modalities will be negotiated next year. Important discussions, and a very important discussion at the Paris event is the role of women in climate financing. So I think all of these are going to be extremely constructive and interesting for us all.
On climate finance specifically, and as you say, I mean, you as Fiji, as the presidency, has been emphasizing the conversational approach to working out the big challenges, but of course there are conflicts and confrontations in the negotiating rooms as well as beyond that. What concretely do you expect of the EU and other wealthy countries in the coming 2 years? I mean, if we speak about pre-2020, to deliver in terms of climate finance, and what if that doesn't materialize in time?
Well, can I first of all talk about the conversational approach that we Pacific Islanders have? At COP23, we introduced the concept of talanoa, which is a way in which we have conversations in the Pacific, and it's based around the concept of storytelling. The idea of telling stories to each other is that it builds empathy and trust and allows you to make commitments for the future. So for the purpose of climate financing, I think the Talanoa dialogue is going to be absolutely crucial, because I think it is during the Talanoa dialogue that parties will be able to have a good discussion about how well climate financing has worked, what is the path for reform for the future, and where we want to be. So the Talanoa dialogue is centered around 3 questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to be? And how are we going to get there? And of course, climate financing.
And that will run throughout the next year.
Throughout the next year, and in fact, it starts with the creation of an online platform where both observers and parties upload their stories. And I think those stories will include stories about climate financing and how effective they have been or ineffective, as the case may be. And then, of course, in May, we're expecting to have a Talanoa with both observers and states and parties. And then we move to the political dialogue at COP24, which will be a Talanoa between state leaders. And I think in that process, climate financing is going to be central. In relation to the European Union, generally the role of the European Union at COP23 was very constructive. It was very supportive of Fiji's presidency. I'm not speaking as a diplomat now, I'm speaking as the chief negotiator. And really, the conversations on all fronts were contributed to by the European Union. So I see the EU in a very important leadership position. It's very promising to see that, but I do think that during the Talanoa dialogue, everybody's going to have to change the way that they talk with each other to adapt to the Pacific way of talking, which is non-judgmental. It's not about blaming people or accusing people of doing things that are less than satisfactory.
Do you think the Poles are a helpful partner in that endeavor?
Actually, they have been so far, and we've had all of the sessions we've had on planning for the Talanoa have been attended by members of the Polish delegation. And I think one of the first parties to actually call the dialogue the Talanoa dialogue was Poland.
We will raise that next time. Next time they block the climate negotiation or ETS, Ms. Gerling, you can throw Talanoa dialogue at them. You were briefly mentioning Donald Trump. What role does the US play and will play next year?
The US played a constructive role this year as well, and I saw that the US delegation did not really dramatically change its negotiation priorities from previous COPs. So their position remained the same, and they were supportive of Fiji's presidency. They attended all the negotiations in a very active way. So clearly, I did not see a sort of downgrading of the presence of the United States in the negotiations. What role they'll play next year, of course, depends very much on the government of the United States.
Do you follow Donald Trump on Twitter?
No.
What would you tweet to Donald Trump?
Get back on the canoe if you are able to.
Amazing. Well, yeah. Well, we will tweet it to him anonymously at some point. So next, I mean, the EU, you were mentioning that the EU has an important leadership role to play. The EU likes to say that of itself, of course, too. And then there's some countries, such as Germany, that once were considered major climate leaders. As you will know now, my home country is in a little political disarray. Are you worried that Germany is going to float out of the climate conversation or a proactive climate conversation in the next months?
Look, if Germany is going to float out, we saw no signs of it in COP. They were very engaged, very supportive. In fact, we really could not have had COP23 in Bonn without the solid support of Germany. And that wasn't just logistical support. It was a symbolic support too, because Germany had the finesse to support us from a very backseat role, from a backseat position, and I thought that showed great sensitivity and great respect for Fiji, and I think that is something that should be mentioned. We are very, very grateful that they had the finesse, as I've said, to do this.
That's good to hear. On the other side, however, we always talk climate leaders, the EU, and of course in Brussels we have a Eurocentric point of view. What's the role of China in the coming year?
China was very strong on the negotiations, and particularly in the pre-2020 discussions, as we expected. And,
just to say that, meaning calling on developed or the wealthy countries to step up efforts to cut emissions, to put up finance, to do more until 2020?
I didn't hear China particularly pointedly calling on developed countries to step up. I thought that the call from every country was for everyone to step up, and I think that is exactly how it should be, because I think nobody is perfect in relation to climate action. We can all do better. But very importantly, I was in Geneva when the president of China made a speech about China's position on climate action. And it was clearly a leadership speech. It was a speech of commitment to the Paris Agreement and a determination to continue with the vision of the Paris Agreement. And that was really a very heartening message to hear from the point of view of the COP23 presidency.
But would you say this also reflects a general change in how the world is organized and where leadership centers can be found? From a world when, for example, climate talks started?
I think that the nuances in leadership depends on the issues we're talking about.
Thank you for that. One final question, because you said everyone has to do more to meet the Paris Climate Deal's goals. What are the 3 sectors that we will have to focus on over the next years to really make it even come close to the 2-degree goal?
Well, of course, energy and agriculture. One of the important outcomes at COP23 was a work program on agriculture called after a Fijian agricultural research station, Coronivia. It was very difficult to get that outcome, and at previous COPs, negotiations really didn't go very far. I'm very happy that it succeeded this time, because I think that the agricultural sector is very important. And this work program is intended to reduce emissions from the agricultural sector. Also, very importantly in this work program is how the small farmers are going to be affected in a very positive way by the work program. And that really is important for the smaller countries, smaller developing countries. So I think that is a very important sector in relation to the reducing of emissions. And I think the third is sort of everything. And I say everything because I think actually the most important way to make progress is to ensure that people are involved in this progress and that they are committed to it, and then they work together. And I see this as one of the most important developments in climate action, the involvement of people. And I see that as the third most important development in climate action.
To convince even the last climate change skeptic that action is needed?
I think so. I mean, you heard our 10-year-old from Fiji telling the world leaders what he thought they should do, and his message was very clear. So I think having people-based and people-focused changes in relation to climate action has got to be the way we go in the future. We cannot forget people in the midst of very complicated negotiations. We can't forget that ultimately it's people who will drive these changes.
Well, thank you very much for that, for the conversation. And with that, I close that part of the discussion and invite the other panelists on stage. I will move over there.
And I will move
and
there.
You will move here. Thank you. So I'd like to call the other panelists on stage. Ms. Julie Girling, an MEP who many of you will know from the European Conservatives and Reformists. She's been following climate files for a long time. Tom Brooks, who works at the European Climate Foundation and is a member of the Executive Management Board, and Yvonne Slingenberg from the European Commission, who's been also negotiating on behalf of the EU during the climate talks. So if I might turn to you right away, because you've been also sitting in the negotiation rooms. What, and also based on discussions about EU leadership and the next year running up to Katowice, what needs to happen for the EU to make next year a success? Like, where do you, as the European Commission, see the main milestones over the next year?
Pretty key question. I think the ambassador already outlined, of course, the process that has been agreed at the COP, the famous Talanoa dialogue, and we're extremely supportive of that. I also wanted to say a really big congratulations to the Fijian presidency, because it was really an excellently managed COP, and frankly, I think that was a real leadership. I don't know, it must have been a daunting task when your prime minister volunteered to take on this COP in Marrakesh, but I think you did an excellent job. So that is where we're looking at, the year ahead, to also with the Fijian and the Polish presidency, upcoming presidency, to go into this Talanoa dialogue. I would fully subscribe to what the ambassador said, that the key issue is to try and enter into a constructive dialogue. This is, I think, what is sometimes challenging in the negotiation rooms, and that is where it is so good that we can have another process whereby it's not just governments, it's not real negotiations on real decision text, it's others, it's stories, it's what is achievable, etc. So for us, the milestones will be that Talanoa dialogue, to really indeed bring our own stories forward, to show that we have been able to succeed in having economic growth while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to showcase individual examples, to showcase how we are supporting developing countries in their challenges, and to really have that dialogue. Because I think we also saw in COP23 that there were somehow some different priorities. Of course, there was the emphasis on pre-2020 action, as you already mentioned, by certain countries. There was the whole story about the impacts of climate change effects, which is also very pertinent. So we kind of had to balance between this very legitimate discussion and the negotiations on the rule book where we wanted to make progress. And I think that will be the challenge for next year as well. We need to make progress in the negotiating room on the rules so that we can complete that at the next COP. But I think it is extremely important that we have a successful Talanoa dialogue, because this is what will inspire countries to look again at their NDCs and to see what more can be done.
From your perspective, especially from civil society, what for you are the key moments next year, and what is your role in bringing COP24 also perhaps to success, a successful conclusion?
Well, I mean, the role of civil society, obviously, in this process is an important one. And I mean, some of that is holding commitments to account and holding governments to account in that process. But I think it also can be a very constructive input to it. I mean, that's where the Talanoa dialogue approach kind of comes into its own to a great extent, because it's hugely inclusive is one of the kind of key terms that defines Talanoa. And obviously, civil society brings with it a great deal of experience from around the world. So you have literally civil society organizations from, you know, the big brands that we all recognize to tiny little 1 and 2 and 3 people organizations from all over the world, bringing stories to that process of the real world impacts of climate change and what is actually happening to them. And obviously, many of those have come out of the Pacific, and it's truly frightening. But you're also seeing, obviously, you know, big developed countries like the United States has been hit incredibly hard by climate change this year. And we're seeing, you know, the forest fires in Southern Europe. All of these events are being made more intense by the impacts of climate change. That's going to be a real thing. So I think bringing those stories to the Talanoa dialogue is incredibly important. I think also civil society is pretty practiced in coalition building and in cooperation. That's something that is kind of the spirit of many civil society organizations, which again, so I think there's a lot of very good experience that can be brought to the process there. But it's going to be a tough year. That's very clear. You know, we've got more balloon text than we had in the Paris Agreement a year out, right? And so there's an awful lot of negotiating that has got to get done. I think those extra sessions are going to be definitely needed. And I think a lot, you know, the European Union is actually hosting one way or another a lot of those events over the coming 12 months. So there's a really, really important role for both the Fijian presidency and the EU's support of the Fijian presidency in you know, through the MOCA, through the pre-COP, the COP.
Just MOCA, just to explain, it's like a revival, no? Now that Trump is out of the picture.
It's great that MOCA is already a known concept.
But no, I think we do need to spell it out.
Yes, now I've got to remember what it stands for.
The Ministerial on Climate Action.
There you go, Ministerial on Climate Action.
I mean, it's essentially a forum that brings together major economies, no? Since the US is no longer...
Yeah, it used to be the Major Economies Forum, yeah. And
but
so,
then, but just to interrupt, because I do agree with. I mean, the inclusion is understanding, since climate change is it's an issue that affects us all. But I think, and Ms. Gerding, since you were sitting in negotiations till 4:30 in the morning to complete the emissions trading system file here in the EU, which has also found conclusion even yesterday, which was a major achievement, of course, for the institutions, but also showed that. Everyone is concerned about climate change, but then when it comes to really agreeing the policies to cut emissions on the ground, it's a little harder, because then suddenly, and you were talking about people, because then suddenly it is about that some people will lose out and some people will win sooner or later. So essentially the next year, there's a lot of talk, but concretely, based on your experience, what has to happen? Where do you think countries need, or...
Well, I can only really speak in terms of what's happening in my own sphere in the EU. And yes, we have completed ETS. It's very hard. Member states, ETS is almost like a sort of little mini version of what has to happen at COP, and that's harder with 196 or whatever. But you know, you've got 28 member states starting from different places, perhaps with slightly different visions of the destination and certainly very different visions of how they're going to get there. So trying to bring that all together is a little microcosm of cooperation. It's politics in the raw, really. And I think it's a really good example of how we do need to be very ambitious. And I'm very subscribed to that, but we also need to have a little bit of realpolitik, and we have to understand how we get there. So I was delighted to get the congratulations from our host, your co-host, about the energy package, but disappointed. I have to tell you, it's not there yet. In many of the files are still in fairly early stages, and we see the same sorts of issues that we saw on ETS playing out in the renewables package, in the energy efficiency, the buildings package, and of course more widely in the EU around our transport strategy, around electrification. All of these things, we have a lot of different elements playing out, and the role of we say the EU, of course, as if there's this sort of amorphous mass, but actually there are so many different players within the EU, and we all have to do our bit. And sometimes when you go to something like COP, it can be somewhat overwhelming in the sense of the task is so huge, but then people like me are working away on the coalface, if we can use that term in this context, but just on our little bit of it. And it's having everybody there also having the commitment to do it. And whilst it sometimes looks like the 28 member states have big differences, and believe me, they do, there is also a strong thread of will to work together to achieve our common aim. And sometimes to the outside world it might look a little bit obscure the way that we do it, but the political will is there with the governments. And you mentioned Poland earlier, and yes, that through ETS was difficult, but on Monday they abstained. Now that might not seem to some people in the audience much of a triumph, but actually I was delighted because, that really does show a move. There was a move there.
So are you confident that Poland, as the host of the COP next year, is going to be problematic, or is going to be maybe reintroducing a little bit of realism into the COP discussion?
Well, I think, and I can't speak for Poland, but I think that they will see it as a challenge to effectively deliver what we would all expect from COP, but also to make sure that there is that reality check and people understand it's not so easy, and sometimes big sacrifices and very big moves, big political change has to take place to get there. So I think it will be very successful, actually.
Do you agree with that?
I certainly hope it will be very successful. Poland does represent a very interesting challenge for the talks and for climate action generally, which is, to a significant degree, the social transition. They've chosen to put the COP in Katowice. It's in the middle of coal mining country in Poland. They have the people, as been talked about as being incredibly important in this, have a very clear concern about the future of their employment, the future of their local economy, and the future of their jobs. That's something that you've got to face. And the whole economy transition, which is non-negotiable, it absolutely has to happen, but it's got to take the people with it, and it's got to have a social aspect. And I think that social pillar of the transition is something that the EU, again, is in a great position to be able to do a lot of work on. The social pillar of the European Union is something that's been developed. There's a lot of policy there, there's a lot of thinking there, there's a lot of experience there. And if you can bring that to bear in the process and really kind of get to grips with the social transition that's going to be necessary, that would be a huge step forward. So it certainly has potential to be a good thing. If they block it on the basis that they want to keep burning coal or give ETS revenues for building coal plants, then no, that's not going to be okay.
Ambassador Khan, you mentioned that one of the three major challenges to cut emissions is the energy sector. Will coal continue to play a role? What's your view on the coal debate from a non-EU perspective?
Look, I think our Prime Minister was asked this in the Bonn zone in one of the press conferences. And he was asked, what do you think about coal? And he said, there's only one answer to that. Coal is not good. But a real challenge for the energy sector then is to look creatively at the future of the energy sector and to put a lot of resources into developing creative and innovative and sustainable clean energy solutions. And I think the energy sector is actually spending a lot of resources on doing this, and I think this is really the way forward. But can I just say, in relation to the Poland question, is a really good discussion for COP24 is just transition. In relation to jobs, in relation to moving to a more sustainable form of employment based on the energy sector. And I think actually from my discussions with the Polish incoming presidency, they're very interested in having that conversation on just transition. So I think it's a very important conversation to have.
I mean, based on the Polish position is of course also that, and I think you've already raised it with the investments in technologies, especially following policy discussions in Brussels, there seems to be one strand of people who are very much focused on the energy source, and others who are focused on the goal. So either cutting emissions and you get there however way. You've already mentioned carbon capture and storage technology and other technological solutions, and others say no, the only way is renewables and clean energy sources. How do you see that discussion play out this year, next year, over the next 10 years? Will we move perhaps away from a focus on energy sources to just technology-only solutions, or?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I think from our experience, we try to do everything of the above, because you cannot pick winners and losers. Yes, we have been working with those who are interested to do carbon capture and storage. There has not been a good takeoff in the past years. Maybe now things look a bit different. I think you will see that also with the ETS, we're putting a price on carbon, and it's not so much to say, okay, it has to be renewables or it has to be energy efficiency. That is not to say that those complementary policies are not needed. Huh? I think there can be a nice push and pull kind of dynamic whereby people go also for renewables targets and they go for cost-efficient options when it comes to energy efficiency, which then drives emissions down, which will lead to an increase in ambition, I'm sure, over time also in the ETS, and that there are provisions now included that actually foresee for that. Of course, the Market Stability Reserve and also the voluntary cancellation of allowances. So for us, I think it has always been clear you need to tap into any option, basically, and of course we need to incentivize the new technologies. I think that's what we try to do. Again, in the ETS, we have this innovation fund where we want to work with industry and also with the energy sector to try and help with financial support those companies that are interested in coming up with breakthrough technologies. So we'll need all of that and then see what works best, basically.
So what general role do market measures have in meeting the Paris climate deal? Is it more, because in the introductory speech the question was raised, how much politics do you need to meet the Paris climate goal? So is it more market or is it more politics that we need over the next years?
It's definitely a combination. I think certainly within the EU structure, we've made the decision that we will have a market measure, that the ETS is very clearly used for that, but there's no way in which it's not the only policy instrument. We have this whole package of other issues, all of which have to be negotiated, and all of which will deliver parts of it. It's the sum of the parts, really. I think perhaps what the EU action does show is that you can't do it just with one measure. No matter how good the market measure is, you have to use other instruments as well. And my own view, having gone through this with the ETS, is that we can deliver more with the ETS. We can continue to deliver, but it's something that we should now be looking outside. The EU should be looking to link up with other ETS systems, and they are developing around the world. We've seen some very encouraging link-ups in the States between California and Canadian provinces. We've seen some action on the east coast of the States, a huge interest from China. And I know that one of the things that characterized COP for many EU officials was the amount of their time that was being taken up by Chinese officials who were really very interested in getting to grips with the nuts and bolts of how we do things. So I think what the EU perhaps should be doing now is looking out to try and share some of that. But, you know, and that's why I like the idea of the Talanoa, because it's not about, you said very clearly it's not about blame, which I'm very happy to hear, but also on the other end of that, it's not about lecturing either, or about saying, you know, we've got the answer, you should do it this way, but it is about saying, well, we've got some answers, and we've had a bit of experience, so you can cut out the tough, difficult bits, and perhaps we can help with putting together systems for other parts of the world that get to the goals much more quickly. It's, you know, for us, it's always the same when you're the early adopters. You have to make some mistakes, so we've had to go through that process. So with the Talanoa, it's not us telling people what to do. It can just, that story can be part of that dialogue.
You wanted to go?
No, I just wanted to comment on what you said, Kalina, in the sense that the tools we have, etc. But I do think the political discussion is imperative also. And I mean, that's in a way what we had with the current ETS and others. I mean, there was this agreement at heads of state and government level back in 2014. And there was a clear desire to make an EU contribution to the Paris Agreement, which didn't exist at that time, to kind of, again, be leaders. And then, of course, knowing that you will have a very difficult debate on how to share the burden, how to implement things. But, and I think this is where we are today. I mean, it's excellent that we have very prominent political leaders who take the stage and who kind of try to push things forward. You mentioned the summit in December in Paris. So that is absolutely key. And before people were commenting, I think you were saying, David, that, you know, cities and regions can't do it alone, but the cities and the regions is the people. You know, and this is where you can bring people in, because they can see themselves that it is feasible, that things are being done, which can then inspire, again, the governments and the political leaders that, actually, you know, I won't be voted down if, you know, I now say that we all actually need to do more. Let's try and do that together, and let's engage in a race to the top, basically. So I think the political is definitely something also very, very important.
On the new leaders, Emmanuel Macron especially, who obviously took to the stage in Bonn, which was a nice performance after Angela Merkel's slightly challenging speech, of course, then in the midst of the coalition talks. What is Emmanuel Macron's role in the EU concert, and what's that open planet summit? One planet, not open planet, Jesus, yeah. One planet summit actually gonna do?
Well, I mean, we'll have to wait and see to some extent. Certainly, I mean, from what we understand at this point, indeed, the finance point, as the ambassador said, is going to be a significant part of that. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the Macron summit is it's obviously related to the political rhythm of the next year, but also slightly outside it to some extent. And it does create a format in which there is a different kind of conversation happening. It's not a negotiation to that extent, I think, as the ambassador said. It links very clearly to the summit that Jerry Brown will be hosting in California next year, which is focused on non-state actors. So it's about, I think, bringing together not only, obviously, heads of state, of whom there will be some, but also, you know, major finance players. There's quite a big role of philanthropy that's going to... Philanthropy is going to play a significant role in that summit as well, and to bring together all of those actors to have a conversation about all of the other pieces that need to get done, as well as the actual core of the negotiations. And I completely agree. It's really important that you've got both the politics and the non-state. The fact that those two tracks have kind of been brought together now, and that they have a rhythm, which is, again, you know, slightly separated but linked, is really important. And I think that, you know, that needs to develop over the coming few years. The idea that, for instance, with the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which was announced in Bonn, the idea that states would sign up to that kind of alliance and immediately would introduce, like, cities and regions and other actors into that wouldn't have happened 3-4 years ago. That wasn't how things worked. So that's a very new development, and I think...
So just as an explanation for those that weren't in Bonn, the UK and Canada officially launched an alliance to essentially quit
phase
coal,
out coal, yeah.
but phase out unabated coal. So that did leave the door open to carbon capture and storage when you were reading the memo carefully. So it was an interesting one on that front. Of course, Ms. Girling, we thought it was interesting to see the UK taking such a prominent role beyond the EU. I mean, the UK-Canada, one could argue, is a new alliance that is more transatlantic than continental. So where do we see the UK in the broader Brexit context, the UK's climate leadership develop over the next years? And what's the EU-UK relationship possibly?
I think I have to plead the fifth. I think that it's very hard to know. One thing I can say, and actually in Bonn, I had a number of people talk to me in a somewhat sceptical way about the role of the UK. And I think regardless of the politics in the UK and indeed any differences I might have with the government on Brexit, I honestly believe that there is no intention for the UK to row back on its climate ambitions at all. If anything, I think it's the opposite, that the UK will want to be absolutely clear that we want to be part of, be in the forefront of new initiatives, and the power past coal is part of that. Linking up with Canada is, maybe that has a wider geopolitical significance, but hey, harness it and use it, because I think it's been useful. And since that was launched last week, a number of other EU countries have joined, Italy, Germany. I mean, which is, with the situation in Germany, that's also good news that they're prepared to sign up to that. So it's another dimension, one that's not yet resolved, but I don't see it being in the long term harmful at all. If anything, I think it will be beneficial.
On that note, maybe we open the discussion to questions from the audience, in case there are any on the topics discussed so far on the future UK role or other countries or the EU's role. Any other, Sarah, my colleague.
Sarah Stefanini with Politico. Just sticking with the Brexit theme just for a minute. We have seen in Brussels recently the talk about the Brexit-proof ETS measure, and so it is starting to come into the conversation. I wonder, another part of the EU's big emissions reduction policy is the effort sharing and the national targets. And the UK has a big goal of its own, and it also plays quite an important role in the international negotiations. So how do you see Brexit playing out here? Will the UK be on the outside of the EU bloc in international relations, but still a big player? What happens with effort sharing if there is a hard Brexit? Thank you.
Well, I would.
So I'd say nobody's going to volunteer. So.
Nobody knows.
I would say first Ms. Girling and then Ms. Singback, also based on the Brexit-proof measure.
Throw something in as well.
Well, I would just respond to say that we don't know, and the difficulty of this is it's all playing out in the very sharp light, very bright light of the Article 50 negotiations, and it's probably the very worst time to make any public pronouncements on this, because we're in the UK anxiously waiting to see if negotiations on Article 50 will be able to progress beyond the items that have been put down to be resolved first. Whatever your view on Brexit is, I think it's important that we should all share that goal, that we want to progress those talks. Throwing the ETS into that was unfortunate timing, but it was resolved to the extent that the UK were able to support the ETS proposal on Monday, with small caveats, but I think that those will be resolved on the 30th of November. We also have to, yes, look at effort sharing in that light, but I think, again, these things will happen through the fact that we all need them to be resolved, and we'll all work together to make sure that they are resolved. It's just very, very tricky timing at this moment.
Ms. Langenberg.
No, I think I'm glad Mrs. Gerling went first because, of course, everything is in the hands of the United Kingdom themselves in terms of deciding, you know, do they want to continue to participate in the ETS? Do they want to continue teaming up with the rest of the EU or EU27 on the effort sharing, yes or no? You know, we have commitments with other countries such as Iceland and Norway who will be part of the at least minus 40. So, I mean, that's certainly, I think, the preferred option for the EU27, but of course it's part of the overall negotiations, as you said. And then I think the fact that we had to come up with proposals to on the ETS and how to possibly deal with a hard Brexit, I think is related to the fact that the Commission still has a task to look after the internal market. I mean, the ETS is a market, we have market operators, and we simply need to make sure that if ever there is this hard Brexit, which nobody wants, that there isn't chaos, you know, and the ensuing consequences of uncertainty about allowances and what have you. So that needed to be done. Now it is a safeguard measure, and let's hope we don't need to go there. But and I'm very pleased that indeed, you know, we are looking at pragmatic ways to put these things in place without too much, you know, making too big a fuss about it in a way, because, you know, it's just to make sure that everybody, and I think the market operators in the room, I hope they appreciate, you know, that there is clarity, because otherwise we did already get a lot of questions about this. Well, now it's clear what the situation would be if it happens, and let's hope we don't need to go there.
Do the market players in the room agree with that? Are you clear on what happens? The UK falls out of the EU and then the ETS market crashes at the end?
No, it does not crash. Well, the vote needs to happen under comitology on the 30th of November, but I mean, it will not crash. That's exactly the purpose.
Yeah.
Galina, thank you. Mark Johnston. The EU27 position is actually no cherry picking. I don't think it's possible to say the EU27 wants the UK to be in our climate laws on the basis of the position in the negotiations so far. And given, as I see it, given the UK Prime Minister's red lines, no single market, no court, it's obvious the UK leaves ETS. I think it will be in 3 years' time at the end of phase 3, rather than 1.5 years' time. So it'll be dealt with in the transition phase, but not after that, without a change of position in London. So your first comment I agree with, it's up to the UK, but specifically it's up to the UK to change their position from its present position if they want to stay in. Thank you.
Do you agree with that? Do I have a comment on that?
It's factually correct, but all I would say is that, I mean, every day, and we'd take the ETS negotiation, we started off with 2 very different positions and lots of red lines, but we ended up with a deal. I don't know whether the UK government or indeed the Article 50 task force are flexible enough to get to that. I hope they are in the end, but I can see why sitting here now we don't think that will happen, because we have got a slow motion train crash happening. And but I'm an optimist.
I think, as you said, and on that sense, going back to negotiations, and you were mentioning, Ms. Brooks, earlier that the talks in Katowice will be very hard.
Yep.
And Ambassador Khan, you've already mentioned that China has taken on a leadership role, has become more prominent also in stating its positions on climate files, and also even vis-à-vis the US, which was, I guess, surprising to many that China would be so outspoken. We're now turning to the panel, since we haven't discussed China in much detail. Where do you see China's role over the next year and the next years in the climate debates, and which other climate leaders or political leaders might be emerging over the next years?
Well, I think the role of China is very exciting, actually, and I think I said before that they're very, very keen to learn a lot more about ETS. Very, very keen to get on with that. I think they've set their own all kinds of internal targets now. The most public profile one is the one about the electrification of cars, but there are lots of others as well, targets that they've set. we may all wonder how they will achieve it, because they're a very different political system to ours. But I do think that they're pretty determined. And the move of the US out of leadership, I think they do feel that they can fill that gap a little bit. I don't think they were quite as active in Bonn as I expected them to be on that front. And I don't know if that, because I'm not close enough to the diplomacy of it, so I don't know if that was because they felt that that might look a little bit overbearing, a bit too sort of obvious jumping into the seat, and they wanted to do a little bit more softly, or whether it's simply they're not quite ready for it yet. But it seemed to me very clear that they were moving towards that, and much more approachable, if that's the right one. Maybe that's not the right. I don't know diplomatic language, but I think as in much less inscrutable and, only talking in sort of soundbite sentences, a little bit more sort of at the human level, I think, when I was in contact with them.
Did you have the same feeling, the Chinese becoming more human?
I think
That's why you have to be careful what you say when there are journalists around, because they paraphrase you.
the idea for the title of the COP decision, the Fiji Momentum for Implementation, actually came from the Chinese delegation, because they thought that that's what COP23 was really about. It was about gaining momentum for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. That is a very clear signal about what China thinks should happen to the Paris Agreement. And I saw that as being very positive. But I saw what happened in every delegation, I have to say without exception, and that is in the first week when the negotiators were there alone, things got very technical and sometimes very nitpicking. When their ministerial heads arrived, suddenly we had visionary conversations. And it happened with every delegation. So I don't think that China was unique in this, but it certainly happened with China. When the Chinese minister for the environment came, and he's a very experienced negotiator himself, we had some very interesting and very constructive bilaterals with the Chinese delegation about how we saw the way forward with the Paris Agreement. And we didn't see any discernible difference in their vision and Fiji's vision, for instance. So that was very encouraging.
So what was the most memorable sentence from one of those bilaterals?
We support an accelerated progress towards the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that was a very, very good signal, and incidentally, very similar to the words used by the EU in a bilateral with the EU.
Would
so
you
that
agree?
was promising.
Are the EU and China coming ever closer?
Well, I think indeed already the relationship was very good in Paris. So of course we have tried to continue building on that, and indeed we have established very good cooperation on all kinds of, let's say, practical implementation approaches. I mean, ETS is one of them, but we work with them on general monitoring, reporting, modeling, all kinds of policy-related issues. So that's extremely encouraging. And you mentioned in the beginning, Kalina, I mean, the MOCA, the Ministerial Meeting on Climate Action, is something where we were very encouraged by the fact that, we wanted to have a wider spread, that it wasn't just the EU who convenes this and, who kind of drives this ministerial engagement and dialogue. And it was great to see that China, was ready to step into that role together with the EU and Canada. So we are also very encouraged by the cooperation we have with China, and we indeed hope that we can get this acceleration. I mean, of course, as I said in the beginning, I mean, there are different tracks. I mean, one thing is acceleration of action on the ground, and I think that is extremely encouraging, and we'll see it again in Paris. And the other thing is the rule book. Now, I think on the rule book, the negotiators, they have their long track history, and this isn't always easy, and it isn't always so straight towards the end line. But okay, we have another year, we'll have another session, and I think at least what I came out of in the bilateral that the commissioner had with Minister Xie was indeed encouraging. So, fingers crossed.
Yeah, I remember she saying at one event that they were great friends, that they fight a lot, but they fight as friends, which was a nice soundbite to catch. Yeah. But on China specifically, and speaking about actions on the ground, I mean, China is, of course, one of those countries that is pushing electric cars quite aggressively is because of its political system, pushing some of the solutions on the ground perhaps a little bit more forcefully, or at least more in a more centralized fashion than the EU can, which has its advantages and disadvantages, I guess. On those concrete efforts, and especially electrifying cars, everyone will know the Commission came out with CO2 emissions targets for cars to reduce emissions from transport. Transport is one of the major challenges in the EU and beyond that to reduce emissions. Will we still be driving individual passenger cars in 2050? Yes or no?
2050, I suppose no?
I doubt it, but I think that there's more similarities between the EU and China in that process, which I think you can probably draw out possibly more usefully than a guess about the future of transportation. Both are about to overshoot their current climate goals. That's very clear. How you then deal with that is a problem that both of them face, and that's potentially interesting. Also, generally have been on an interesting and obviously downward. Hopefully emissions track for the last few years, but have seen some blips, right? We've had a rise in emissions in both France and Germany in 2016. China have a lot to do. It looks like they've brought forward their peaking date. It's more like 2020 to 2025 now, rather than 2030. To peak their emissions. To peak their emissions. But it does look more like peak and plateau than it looks like peak and massive decline. And that's where it has to be. And even under their current plans, they're saying they'll produce 50% of their electricity through non-fossil fuels by 2030, but if you look into the detail of that, there's also the possibility of more than 50% fossil fuels still operating in primary energy by 2050, which is clearly way off mark. I mean, there's absolutely no way that that's Paris compatible. And also, of course, there is an ETS deal done, but the ETS is not Paris compatible either. It doesn't quite deliver 80%, never mind 95%. And so I think one of the other interesting elements, particularly of the MOCA process and various other pieces this year, is going to be the world's big emitters coming together and starting to kind of work through these problems, because there's huge policy challenges, I think, that remain. And for the EU, 2030 package doesn't get us, it isn't Paris compatible, right? So what's the next stage? What does that look like? How do you get there? And for China, what they're currently putting on the table is not Paris compatible either. So I think the political leadership is starting to look really interesting. It's got to be made practical, and it's got to be made practical pretty quickly.
So in that, when you say, so it seems like no country has policies in place that are Paris compatible, no? I think that is, I would
argue Costa Rica.
I'd like to live in Costa Rica, but yeah.
0 in 2030 or something, so I can
100% renewable for 300 days, I believe, at this point.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I think given the weather in Brussels, we'll never get there here. But but I mean, you are raising the issue that the problem is that we're moving towards, perhaps we're moving towards a goal, but nobody is there, and there's a lot of work ahead. And China is already given the system, and you're saying even though the politics of China doesn't make it reach its goal, even implement policy goals that are even near what is required for the Paris deal, the EU has its own troubles. So concretely, where are the three biggest challenges for the EU now? Like, what does the EU concretely have to do if you already sit here and you say the clean energy package doesn't cut it?
Well, I think, I mean, fairly clearly, there are questions about whether or not the structures or the tools, if you will, that we currently have in the toolbox are good enough. So I think that there are some significant questions around how you do what get termed in the EU as complementary measures, as in you have the carbon pricing as the core and the complementary measures around the sides. I think that probably needs flipping on its head to some extent. In fact, in a way, carbon pricing is the sweeper, right? Carbon pricing is what catches up at the edges. You need sector-specific policy, and you need to be able to drive those home.
So meaning what? Emissions in buildings, cut emissions in buildings?
Buildings, transport, energy, land use. It's a huge and outstanding issue. We're about to go into reform of the CAP. We're about to go into the MFF negotiations.
Budget.
Sorry, the budget, the EU budget, the multi-year financial framework. That is a very, very large financial instrument. I think it's only about 2% of EU GDP, but it's significant and it's very flexible. And it sets a tone for 7 years, and that's a long time in climate terms. We probably are in the last decade in which the world has a serious shot at 1.5 for sure, and possibly even 2 degrees. And so this next decade becomes incredibly important. So decisions like the MFF, for example, the EU budget, become vital to that. And we have a 20% greening commitment. But what does that mean? How does that get implemented? If the council opens up some of the rules around ETS and allows, money to go back into fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, you've got to act on that stuff now.
So essentially the next 10 years, you say? The next 10 years?
Yeah, the next 10 years are what absolutely
So in that
counts.
window, given your work in the Commission and Ms. Going in the European Parliament, can the EU make all of those major changes happen in the next 10 years? Is that realistic?
Well, I think we've indeed put the proposals forward that implement our current target, and we know indeed, like you said, I mean, this current target is not going to be the final contribution that the EU needs to make in order to reach these net zero emission world and the low carbon society. So of course we are conscious of the fact that we will need to come back and see what we can scale up. But nevertheless, this is a major transformation. I think the energy market transformation is going to be, the market, how the market operates will set the scene for then keeping on increasing renewable energy in there. But again, I think, and we don't have any business people on the panel, but I mean, and that is what I find so interesting again in this non-state actors trajectory, that there are many things that maybe, we have not foreseen today, but that can be breakthrough. I mean, your question about the cars is a pretty telling one. I mean, yes, we're putting targets for electrical vehicles, but I mean, maybe soon people will not own private cars and maybe things will go much faster. So that's actually the very encouraging agenda, which again, I think is key for the politics also. So, well, we will need to look at that. We'll need to look at the new science. We'll again need to have that political debate. And I think it's good to again come back to the people. We will be having, because you mentioned, Tom, the MFF, but the MFF is indeed, a EU budget, public money. I think the more important here is also the private money. And we know this is going to be essential in order to accomplish all the necessary investments to drive this clean energy transition. And that is where, it will be very, very interesting to observe what people are doing. And we, of course, already see it. People are divesting from certain investments. There is real interest in trying to reward green investments, green bonds, what have you. And I mean, maybe we'll be outpaced. So it's, of course, we try to do what we can at the EU level, and we will need to keep on coming back. That's also the intrinsically super interesting element in the Paris Agreement, that, it's not just, okay, now we've done it, and we are proud that we have, and we are putting in legislation all the necessary things to achieve our at least -40, but then we'll need to go further. So we're going to be in there, with everybody to step up ambition.
On that note, I would like to ask you all a personal question, and keep the answer short there, but what is your biggest personal contribution in your daily life to cutting emissions and saving the planet?
Well, tomorrow I should be getting a new car, which will be hybrid. It's difficult because, frankly, electrical car would have had one for a long time if it wasn't for the very bad charging infrastructure, basically non-existent in Brussels. So that's a bit difficult. And, we have thermo heating on the roof, and we have solar panels, and we've insulated massively. So I can personally testify to the energy performance in buildings and all the rest of it. So yeah, but I have to say, I mean, means to pay is a different thing. So I think, again, how the national development banks, how the banks can be persuaded that it's interesting and that people should be getting more interesting loans when they want to invest in energy efficiency, for example, is somewhere where we need to go. I mean, we can't be the sole example.
Ambassador Khan?
Walking and no plastic bags, and Fiji's just passed a law which charges rates for the use of plastic bags, so I'm very pleased that that's just happened.
I cycle everywhere. My house is, again, done all of that stuff in my house. My bicycle, unfortunately, got nicked last night. So I'm feeling pretty bruised about that, I've got to say. I really very reliant on my bicycle, and it was a very nice bicycle. But that's Brussels for you. Yeah, try to use public transport wherever we can. Take trains, don't fly. All of those things. But I think also the point about plastic bags and food is incredibly important in all of this, and not using packaging. And I think trying to make sure
that...
So
no meat, only meat once a week?
All vegetarians.
Ms. Gerling?
Well, I think I must be a bit of a hypocrite because I eat meat, I fly a lot, That's my job, I guess. I try wherever I can to walk. I'm a very low user of Parliament cars. I think I must be very low, very down the bottom of the list. I'm not sure that that's a terribly big contribution. I live in a house that I'm not allowed to put any solar panels on under British regulation. I live in a house in an area of outstanding natural beauty, so I'm not allowed to do that. I've also got a diesel car. I'm being very honest, as I live in a 1 in 7 hill and it snows quite a lot, so I couldn't manage without a 4-wheel drive. So putting all those things to one side, I think that I'm probably more typical than maybe the rest of the panel. So, and I like to live the life that my constituents expect. No, seriously, I like everybody have taken and made changes in my life. I put that list simply because I wanted to make the point that for many of us there are limitations. And you asked the question earlier about will we be driving personal cars? Well, no, if you're sitting in the middle of a city, it's really easy to say no, we won't. But I don't know how the hell I'm going to get, well, I won't be here in 2050, but if I were, how on earth I would live without personal private transport where I live, simply not possible.
Well, thank you very much for that. I guess that's it's a healthy reminder that there's still a lot to be done, and that there's a lot of questions and people's lives probably to be considered in the policy debates. And I guess everyone living in Brussels knows that living in certain cities makes you think that the world does look a little different than when you leave the city. So thank you for that, and thanks for all the panelists, and thanks to the audience. With that, I say goodbye. Thank you.